you're in tune to the spiritual world that's out there. We'd like to ask you. There we go. It's finally up and recording. I'm sorry, the first couple minutes, technical issue, we weren't able to record, but we'll get there. So someone asked the Chafetz Chaim, what is going to be the fate? We here's Hitler. He's making all of these terrible threats against Jewry, not just in Germany, but around the world, and not just in Europe, but really around the world. What do you think is going to be the fate of Klal Yisrael with all this? So it says as follows. They asked him specifically Ashkenaz of Poland, in Germany and in Poland. Achrei asher harasha tzorer hichriz bepumbi amatraso la'achir shem Yisrael Chalila. He has this maniacal foe of ours has been making all sorts of public announcements that he wants to totally destroy, to totally blot out the Jewish people, God forbid. Next paragraph. What did the Chafetz Chaim respond when he was asked about this, about how to whether or not Hitler would be successful? It can't possibly be. It can't be that he would ever be successful at annihilating the entire Jewish people. Even though that's what he's saying that he wants to do, it can't be that he would succeed. As kol amenu. No enemy of Am Yisrael. They've inflicted horrible damages on us. They've inflicted terrible suffering. But no one has ever succeeded in totally knocking off Klal Yisrael. He says, "B'chol artzos pizurenu." In all the lands where we are, it's never been done, and it can't happen. Kasav mefurashu, and in fact, the pasuk tells us specifically, "Im yavo Esav el hamachana achas v'yiko," that if Esav would ever come, Esav meaning figuratively, not metaphorically, is talking about the enemy of the Jews, not just this one Esav, but throughout history, if there ever would come an Esav who's going to attack Am Yisrael, there always will be another camp that will survive. So he was telling the student, yes, he has awful plans. And I can't guarantee that we're not going to suffer terribly. But what I can tell you is Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, will not be totally destroyed because of Parshas Vayishlach. Yaakov Avinu told us that this is the way it's meant to be. That if Esav ever attacks, there always will be not just a remnant, there will be a section of Am Yisrael who survives. Haven Hashoel. So the person who was asking the Chafetz Chaim this question understood Ki asakana krova, that there is terrible danger on the horizon, because the Chafetz Chaim is not saying everything's going to be okay. He didn't say that. He just said, he says that even if we do suffer an awful, terrible loss, there will be, Klal Yisrael will still exist. So he continued to ask him a little further. Let's say he is, God forbid, successful at annihilating European Jewry, Rov Minyan Ubinyan Shalom Yisrael, which really is at that time the majority of where the Jews were. What is, in your estimation, what is this sizable chunk that is going to survive? So the Chafetz Chaim immediately responds with a pasuk in Ovadia, because don't we all have the psukim from Ovadia on our fingertips? So the Chafetz Chaim responds with a pasuk in Ovadia. Gamzeh Kasuv Mefurash. It's straight out in the Navi, B'divrei Neviim, that it says in Ovadia, Uvahar Tzion Tieh Pleita Vaya Kodesh. Har Tzion, meaning in Israel, in the mountains of Zion, there will be a remnant Vaya Kodesh, and it will be sanctified, it will be holy. So he's saying, even if God forbid Hitler is successful in Europe, you could rest assured he's not going to make it to Israel, and you could rest assured that Jewry in Israel is going to be safe. And this rabbi who was asking these questions, so Chafetz Chaim left with his hands shaking. Al Churban Yadus Erupa. He was just shaken to the core that he was saying that even if European Jewry is going to be decimated, Jews in Israel are going to survive. Even though he was so frightened for Jews in Europe, at least in his heart, he felt some reassuredness that the Jews living in our holy land, they would be saved. And no sword, no enemy oppressor would pass through Israel. And that's actually the way it played out in World War II. What was the point, if you had to gauge where in the war, at what point did Hitler's army suffer a setback and the tide began to turn? when Hitler's forces tried to approach Israel, when Rommel, it was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, we're going to read about him in a minute, when he was on his Africa campaign, correct, when he was severely beaten and his Africa Corps was beaten, that's when the tide seems to have turned against the Nazis. V'tigzar Omer v'yikum, and I don't know what that word is. V'tigzar Omer v'yikum, the gezeres meaning the decrees of Hashem, as he told the Nevi'im. It said in Ovadia that there's going to be the remnant of Israel will be fine and they will be sanctified. God decreed that through his Navi Ovadia, and that's going to always stand. V'divrei Chafetz Chaim, and also those words of the Chafetz Chaim that hearkened. He said, "Look at Ovadia. That's where we need to look." Shenemru Eser Shanim Kodem Shenichra Vayadus Rupa. That he was telling the student. This was really the last year of the Chafetz Chaim's life because he died in 33. So what he told it was 10. This is 10 years before the decimation of European Jewry. That nobody could have imagined that. Here it was Niskaimu al Artsena Akdosha. That look how everything was fulfilled, that the Jews living in our promised land in Israel, Asher Einei Hashem Hayibo La'atzila, the eyes of God were on the land of Israel to save it, Mishnei Arayos, from all the lions. King Yagen Hashem al Artsenu Akdosha Gamata. So he's saying, so too, just like God looked after the Jews in Israel based on that pasuk in Ovadia, and he saved the Jews in Israel from its oppressors, may that also be the case nowadays. Kisharabim Tzarreinu V'Yachish Eis Pidyon. When we have so many enemies and we desperately await the time of our redemption, may that prophecy from Ovadia hold true, that we will always be able to say, V'Har Tzion Tia Pleta V'Yakodesh, that in Har Tzion, in the mountains of Israel, there will be the remnant of Israel. That's where we will be untouched and we will be sanctified. Now, this is a beautiful report that's in the Chafetz Chaim al Torah. I think I might be able to shed a little bit of light on this. They reported in here that it was one of his Rosh Yeshiva, one of his lecturers in his yeshiva that had this conversation with him. I'm not so sure that we can't say it was someone else. First of all, here's the pasuk from Ovadia. There it is. It's in chapter 1, pasuk 17. So it's Perak Aleph, pasuk Yud Zayin. Uvahar Tzion Tia Pleta. On Mount Zion, there will be a remnant. Vaya Kodesh, it'll be holy. That building you see there is a picture of a yeshiva, a very famous yeshiva in Bnei Brak called the Panovich Yeshiva. And you see there's an Israeli flag flying. That's its tradition every year on Yom Ha'atzmaut. They always fly the Israeli flag on top of the yeshiva, even though they hashkafically would not put themselves into the religious Zionist orientation. The founder of that yeshiva was Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman, who was known as the Panovich Rav. He was the last Rav in Panovich, where he built the yeshivas in Panovich. And we'll talk about him in a second. His reaction was, well, in Lithuania, and Lithuania Independence Day, I flew the flag. Why should it be any different here? I just don't understand what the issue is. We could say, have debates about whether we're Nevi'im or not, where we're prophets, that we could say what the role of this is. That's all nice, but why on earth shouldn't we fly a flag? It's to show some appreciation to the fact that there's that it's the Independence Day in Lithuania. What this should be worse than Lithuania? What on earth? So to this day, even though he's passed away long ago, that's still their tradition. That's that picture. But let's look at that building for a second. It says Heichal HaTorah. This is I guess the central base medrash. This is the Hall of Torah, and it was named after, I guess, the philanthropist was Tzvi Eliezer Kreiser. Okay, but look at this pasuk that's on the building. Uvahar Tzion Tia Pleta V'Haya Kodesh. That's the pasuk from Ovadia. That Rav Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman, of all the psukim, he could put very uncommon pasuk. I don't think anyone, if we would ask most Jews, where's that taken from? I don't think anyone's familiar with Ovadia that they would know to point there. Of all the psukim out there, why did Rav Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman put that pasuk there? Well, it's an awesome pasuk, yeah, 100%. But like what he's holding in Sefer Ovadia. So look at this is something fascinating. A little piece of history. Rabbi Beryl Wein wrote this. Founding yeshiva as Rommel arrives. At the height of Hitler's power, he's sent into North Africa, the Africa Corps, led by arguably his greatest general, Erwin. Oh, I'm sorry, let me turn the page here. Erwin Rommel, who would be famous as the Desert Fox for his brilliant tactics in desert warfare. Although the British had routed Germany's ally Italy and its much larger army, when Rommel I don't know if something's wrong there. When Rommel completely turned around the situation for the Nazis. Despite Rommel's success, the British rallied around their defense of a key port fortress, Tobruk, in Libya during the summer of 41. The British defenders proudly called themselves the Desert Rats for having withstood the vaunted Desert Fox. However, a year later in the summer of 42, Rommel shocked the Desert Rats and took over Tobruk. The entire British nation was stunned. Morale was at an all-time low. So it looks like at this point, Rommel's just going to keep on marching. Rommel's forces stood perched on the doorstep of Egypt, threatening to take over the strategic Suez Canal, as well as all Arabian lands beyond and their vast oil wealth for Hitler's war machine. So it looks like they're marching on. Next page, top of page 3. So it says, as Rommel's Africa Corps. Yeah, he's missing a couple of words here. My guess is they dictated this. You know, when you do dictation, it never comes out 100% right. So my guess is Rabbi Wein probably was speaking. This is dictated. As Rammel's Africa Corps pushed deeper into Egypt, the British garrison in Palestine began burning its documents and planning on retreating to Iraq. German planes bombed Tel Aviv. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who admired Hitler and shared his obsessive hatred of Jews, said he was going to kill every Jew. Only a miracle could stop Rommel, it seemed. The day that Rommel's armor advanced to its farthest point, to an otherwise unknown town called El Alamein, one of the leading rabbis in Palestine at the time, Yosef Kahneman, laid the cornerstone of a new yeshiva, Torah Academy, in Israel in the town of, it says there Panovich, it's Bnei Brak, but he called it Panovich because he was the Panovich Rav. He wanted to name it after his town, which was destroyed by the Nazis. So the tradition was on the day when everyone was panicking, when Rommel was at his zenith, was really making a height, that's when he has a cornerstone laying ceremony. And everyone says to him, are you out of your mind? The British are burning documents. Everyone's planning that everything's about to fall apart. It was an audacious move, one that dismayed not only ardent secularists, but even fellow religious Jews. What are you doing? People asked him incredulously. The Germans are going to be here in a few days. So his response was, even if I'm able to spread Torah learning for only a few days, he confidently replied, that in itself would be of eternal significance. As it turned out, Rommel was stopped. It was a major turning point of the war. As for Rabbi Kahneman's yeshiva, not only outlived Rommel and the Thousand-Year Reich, but became the Harvard of modern Israel's yeshivas, still churning out some of the nation's greatest Torah scholars to this day. Now, let me tell you something else about Rabbi Kahneman. You know who he was a Talmud Muvhak of, who he was a very close disciple of? The Chafetz Chaim. I would not be surprised to put this all together that it was Rabbi Kahneman who had this conversation with the Chafetz Chaim. It wasn't one of the Rosh Yeshiva of Radin in 1933 who had this conversation, but rather Rabbi Kahneman, who was coming to visit his Rebbe. Rabbi Kahneman at this point is the rabbi of Panovich. He heads the yeshiva in Panovich, coming to visit his Rebbe, who's very sick and very old and very sick and near going to depart. And he's the one who had this conversation. And the Chafetz Chaim assures him with this pasuk from Avadia, saying about an Hartzion Plata, and that would explain why that pasuk finds itself on the front of the building, on that facade of the Yeshiva Panovich. Of all the psukim in Tanakh that could have been there, why that pasuk is there, and also what gave him the confidence that at the height of Rommel's advance to go ahead and lay the cornerstone for that yeshiva and that sandy hill in an undeveloped town, because nothing had really been developed yet in Bnei Brak at that time. I would not be surprised if that was Rabbi Kahneman, who was the one who had that conversation with the Chafetz Chaim, not one of the Rosh Yeshiva of the Radin Yeshiva, but one of his students who was a Rosh Yeshiva of a town of Panovich that was about to be destroyed within, I think the Nazis marched in 41. This is also an astonishing thing. Rabbi Kahneman was away from Panovich at the outbreak of World War II. I think he was on a fundraising mission. He was going to go to America and he was also going to go to Israel. And he ended up being trapped in Israel when the war broke out. He was separated from his whole town. His yeshiva was annihilated when the Nazis rolled into Panovich. This was before, when they were attacking parts of Lithuania. They weren't yet putting Jews in ghettos and shipping them to death camps. They had these mobile killing squads and much of Lithuania. That's how they, together with Lithuanian collaborators, that's how they met their end. That's how Panovich was destroyed. His wife and children were killed in that as well. People say that he lived the rest of his life. You might call it survivor's guilt, almost wondering, well, if God spared me, what can I do to build? And he was just on this mission, building orphanages after the war. incredible. They say he was a very savvy fundraiser. Aside from being a great Talmud Chacham, people say he was a passionate speaker, and he could just reduce an audience to tears in just with a sentence or two, and just get people to open their wallets. And they say he was an incredible fundraiser. I'll tell you one last thing I heard about him. Rabbi Beryl Wein had a personal relationship with him because Rabbi Wein for years was a rabbi in Miami Beach, Florida, and the Panovich Rav used to come down there often, at least once every winter, to fundraise from people down there. Rabbi Wein, as a young rabbi, would drive him around and spend time with him. So he has a number of phenomenal stories of spending time with him. One of them that I heard him share was this is incredible. Apparently, he went to someone who was very, very bitterly anti-religious, and told the Panovich Rav that he had incredible amount of assets, and he was a philanthropist. He's looking to give away money, but he says, I wouldn't give money to an institution that you'd build. So he says, why? So he says, I'm very, against religion. He goes, I will only, he basically made him a dare. If you're willing to build me a school where the students don't wear yarmulkes and none of the kids have payas, then I'll write you a check for whatever, some exorbitant amount. And he says, it's a deal. He clapped. He says, really? You'll shake on it? So he goes, absolutely. He opened the girls' school. Yeah. Really was a very savvy, it was a very savvy fundraiser too. Yeah, but apparently he just had an incredible ability. But I would really not be surprised if that helps put together this piece of history there. All right, I want to share with you two more pieces that have to do with anti-Semitism. And again, I don't think it's a great surprise that we're going to find this in this parsha, because again, this is really the parsha that deals with Yaakov having that long-awaited reunion slash confrontation with Esav. And as we said, the Gemara tells us that there were Tanaim that would study this parsha in depth before they went on a diplomatic mission to Rome to try to figure out what can I better understand about Esav, because Rome was seen as being the descendants of Esav. What can we better understand to prepare for this mission? So I don't think it's going to come as a surprise that you'll find many of the Mefarshim will have pieces that deal with anti-Semitism in this parsha. I want to share with you two of them that I found. One of them I think we'll all realize, oh, that's a prime spot to throw this in. So let's see, this first one is talking about when Esav and Yaakov finally have that long anticipated and in some ways dreaded reunion. The pasuk says it's Perek Lamed Gimel, chapter 33, pasuk Daled. Vayaretz.
34 years after he leaves?
It's at least 20 because he worked 7 years for each of his wives.
So
That's 14, and then another 6 years for Lavan. So it's at least 20 years later. Oh, but then he had 14 of learning in Yeshiva Shem V'Aver. So it's 34, at least 34 years after. Correct. At least 34 years later. You're right, 100%.
He married Rachel.
No, the first
7
wife,
days after
Leah, but he
Leah.
first had to work 7 years for Leah.
Right.
And then
Then
after
he-
that after that week of festivities, he marries Rachel, works another 7 years, and then another 6. So it's 7, 7, and 6. So well, that's what he tells his wives at the end of last week's parsha when he's leaving. He says, "I worked 7 years for each of you, and then an additional 6 years for your dad." So that's what that was the work that he put in. So that's 20 plus 30, at least 34 years. Yeah. So the Torah tells us Vayaretz Esav l'kraso. So Esav, when he sees his brother Yaakov, he runs to greet him. Vayichabkeu, he throws him in a big bear hug. Vayipol atzarov, he falls on his neck. Vayishakeu, and he cries. Yishakeu, and he cries. I'm sorry, Vayishakeu, and he kissed him. Vayibchu, and they cried. So if you notice on top of the word Vayishakeu, there's dots. If you would open any Sefer Torah, you'll find those dots there. There are several times in the Torah that we have a Mesorah that it's almost like it's being underlined. We have a Mesorah tradition is that dots are supposed to appear here that draws our attention to that word. So there's all sorts of darshaning that you'll find in Medrash. Okay, our eyes are now drawn to it. What is the message we're supposed to get? So Rashi quotes this Medrash that says it was a machlokas. There was two different Tanaim who had different opinions about what those dots are supposed to tell us. So let's see Rashi. He's quoting the Medrash. It says Vayishakeu. Esav gave him a big kiss. Nakud alav. There are nakudot. There are dots on top of it. V'yesh cholken badavar. There's a dispute as to what that is. What's the message of those dots? Bebraisa de Sifri. You'll find this in the Sifri, which is one of our early midrashim. Yesh shadarshu nakuda zo Shelo nashku b'chol libo. The first opinion is, you know why it's dots there? That even though on the surface this looks like this is a really emotional, loving reunion, he's embracing him. He throws him in a big bear hug and he's kissing him. Don't get carried away with this. It wasn't with a full heart. In other words, it was for show. That's one opinion there, is that don't get carried away. You're right. Two friends, it would have been sincere. This was Esav. It's something slimy here. It wasn't. It's just a rule. And if it was Esav, Hosoneus Yaakov, how do you explain that now he's hugging him and kissing him? So what's this teaching us? He says, Halach b'yadua she'esav sonei Yaakov, ella shenichmeru rachmav ba'oso shah. So he says this was the one time in his life there was an exception to the rule. At this time, somehow or another, his compassion just got his heart melted. At that one moment, unashko b'chol libo. And it really was real. He gave him a kiss, and it was really gave him a hug and kiss, and it was from the heart. It really was real. So the first opinion is, you know why it's dotted? To tell us, come on, this really wasn't what it looks. Don't be fooled by the appearances. And the second opinion is no, this was really crazy because halacha biyadua. It's where the Sifri use that term, and you'll find some commentaries do jump on this. Of all the terms Shimon Bar Yochai could have used, why do you use halacha? So some try to find that there are places you can find this has halachic significance, and other